NCAS formed back in 1987 and has been presenting its free public lectures ever since. Our topic today is fake news and fake journalism. Now, we skeptics are all too familiar with fake news, not just for years, but for decades. When the news media, even some of the more respected publications and broadcasters, have produced uncritical, superficial, and/or incomplete stories about unidentified flying objects, extrasensory perception, questionable health claims, and so forth, in which the findings and perspectives of skeptical investigators are relegated to the second to last paragraph or often omitted entirely. By the way, that's the most pernicious aspect of fake news, omitting information that would otherwise lead their readers or viewers to a different, undesired conclusion. So today we're joined by an expert on the history of fake news and fake journalism. She's Andie Tucher, the H. Gordon Garbedian Professor and the director of the Communications Ph.D. program at the Columbia Journalism School. She writes widely on the evolution of conventions of truth-telling in journalism, photography, personal narrative, and other nonfiction forms. Previously, she worked in documentary production at ABC News and Public Affairs Television Incorporated, and holds a Ph.D. in American Civilization from New York University. She's the author of 3 books, including her latest, Not Exactly Lying, Fake News and Fake Journalism in American History. Joining us from New York City, Professor Andie Tucher.
Hello, and I'm so pleased to be here. I'm delighted to be speaking to a group that, like the best journalists, although certainly not like all journalists, are standing up for critical thinking in an era that really needs it. I have to say that ever since I started writing about history and meaning of fake news, I seem to have become much more interesting. Wherever I go, people are concerned about it. People have had experience with it. Everyone is eager to talk about it. No one can figure out how to deal with it, or even sometimes what it means. Some fake news, of course, is just silly or harmless, relatively, or clearly created to be entertaining and to make money. Like 20 or 30 years ago, the supermarket tabloid Weekly World News seems to have kept the Bat Boy and the alien on retainer. And we all know the internet and social media can spread the most ridiculous stories in the blink of an eye, stories that are understood to be over the top. I don't think anybody believes these, but well, we can hope. But most of the time when we talk about fake news, we have in mind much more troubling stuff, profoundly undemocratic and dangerous, like the activists and agitators who are trying to overturn or delegitimize the 2020 election by spreading misinformation that they know is untrue, or the extremist groups that egg each other on with lies about people they see as enemies, wild conspiracy theories about things like climate change or vaccines. News fakers often use the tools of social media to conceal their identities while sending out messages to huge audiences at little or no cost. And then there are the people who use the term as an accusation. Calling something fake news is a good way to discredit accurate information they happen to disagree with. And although that tactic was for a while strongly identified with former President Trump, we now see it almost everywhere in public life. Just a small selection of headlines, including the accusation of fake news. Some of these are really fake, and some of them are not. So there's every reason for all of us to be deeply dismayed by this vast world of misinformation and disinformation that we call fake news, and the threats it poses to democracy and public life. But there's something else we should be paying attention to. Fake news is deceptive information, which can operate entirely outside the world of conventional journalism. It often comes to us through social media or popular culture. But I focused my work on something I think is even more hazardous to public life, something I'm calling fake journalism, the creation and spread of false information by institutions pretending to be or acting like traditional conventional news organizations in forms crafted to look like they are authentic productions of independent news. And as we go along, I'll invite you to consider the paradox that the way that real journalism evolved in the US helped encourage the spread of fake journalism, even as it's also offered some important weapons against the world of fake journalism. I want to start with a look at US journalism before either fake or real journalism took hold, since you may, and I'm sure you will be, amazed at how terrible much of it was. Beginning in 1690 and continuing for 200 years, US newspapers weren't producing fake journalism because real journalism hadn't really been invented yet. They were, however, producing plenty of fake news. Take a look at the first newspaper ever published in the British North American colonies. September 25th, 1690, the first issue of Publick Occurrences, and it includes in its mission statement the editor's promise that he would expose anyone he found to be spreading fake and false and malicious reports. The first newspaperman in what becomes the United States is telling his readers, trust me, I will tell you the truth and I will expose falsehood. And then he solemnly reports that the King of France, Louis XIV, was sleeping with his daughter-in-law, which was fake news. And one of the reasons we know is that the King of France didn't have a daughter-in-law, at least not at this point. The sickly wife of his only son had died months earlier, and he would have known that as a well-connected newspaperman. Plus, the king had years earlier put aside his libertine ways when he married his devout second wife. So what's Harris doing? The editor, Benjamin Harris, he's a fervent Protestant, and he also knows that the powerful Catholic king is persecuting French Protestants. I think he saw Louis as a mortal enemy and probably figured that this incendiary story with a little hint of incest would sound just truthful enough or just acceptable enough, and also quite damaging enough about an absolute monarch who was also a papist and had a reputation for licentious behavior. So here's Harris exploiting his self-proclaimed position as a truth teller. Trust me, I'm going to tell you the truth, to plant not quite unbelievable information he knows is false, intended to undermine an opponent. A textbook example of fake news. More than 300 years ago, by the first editor in what became the United States who ever said, trust me, I'll tell you the truth. And I do want to emphasize that Americans have always valued and accepted the tradition that newspapers are essential tools for the working of democracy. They're critical for informing citizens about public life and public questions. That's why the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution established protections for the press from outside influence or pressure, including from the government itself. The government is saying we want to encourage the newspaper press to hold us up to scrutiny and give people the information they need to judge how we're doing. But in the 18th and the 19th centuries, when many U.S. citizens had very little access to other kinds of printed matter, newspapers served all sorts of other roles as well. In the 19th century, newspapers didn't work like the papers we're familiar with now. They didn't have trained reporters. They didn't have press passes. They didn't have codes of ethics. They didn't have protocols for checking facts. They didn't have understandings about what editors are supposed to do. Along with the news, they also printed jokes, tall tales, poetry, short stories, recipes, travelers' letters, ads for get-rich-quick schemes, all the stuff readers could have found in a bookstore if they'd had such a thing. And especially the papers in the smaller communities or in the interior, away from the coasts where relatively recent news came by ship, they had no systematic way to gather information from faraway places. They would pick up random snippets of news from other bigger newspapers, from travelers' letters, from rumor. But unlike today, few editors felt any obligation to check their facts because really, how could they? They had to fill those columns somehow, and they were far away from the source. This is from a paper in Pennsylvania, reporting that a Virginia paper reprinted a letter from a man in Illinois who heard from a military messenger about a battle with Native Americans that might have happened elsewhere in Illinois. And like many editors, he felt no obligation, no ability really, to actually vouch for the accuracy of what he said. So this is a common headline in many newspapers at the time. It's important if true, but if it's false, oh, never mind. And we'll leave it up to you to figure out which it is. Later in this century, the column of telegraphic news from all over the country becomes commonplace. Stuff that comes in over the wires without context, without explanation, almost like tweets. This is a very typical column you can see in a paper from southeastern Indiana. And in this one, we learned that Queen Victoria has 12 grandchildren, and probably some people even know who Queen Victoria was. Paris has 23 horseflesh markets, and rats cannot live in Alaska because their holes freeze up, nor in St. Thomas because their holes are turned wrong side out by earthquakes. If any of you have any insights into what this is, what he's talking about, I would love to hear it. I've never been able to figure it out. But given all the content, the varied kinds of content that readers were encountering in their newspapers, it seems perfectly possible they would not have automatically accepted all of this as equally true and valid. They would have mentally sorted the rats and the queen into categories of the dubious and the true. Another big difference in the 18th and 19th centuries was there was no such thing as objectivity, not because no one believed in it, but because no one would have seen any point to it. Many newspapers were owned and edited by political parties. They were known for their incendiary, hyper-partisan attacks on the other side. That was the whole idea. Newspapers were intended to make political arguments on behalf of the party that supported them and that paid the editor. If the paper didn't support your party with all of the enthusiasm it could muster, what was the point of having a paper? It didn't break any rules against engaging in partisanship or expressing opinion, because those rules just didn't exist at the time. Newspapers were giving their readers and subjects exactly what they wanted. That's what newspapers do. So here, for instance, is a perfectly vicious attack. Came out in the era of the first political parties. And it's about, can you tell? Haunted by horrors, he haunted them. And he was aristocratic. He was monster of monsters. He was a lewd slave to lust. Alexander Hamilton, who is not yet the star of a rap musical. But this is a perfectly vicious attack of a sort that was perfectly common in the early years of the Republic, when citizens are struggling to figure out exactly how a nation that is supposed to be based on democratic deliberation would actually work in practice when no one had ever seen such a thing. So they're trying to work out how you carry out debate in public about issues of importance. In the 1830s, the penny press is born, cheap and lively papers intended to make lots of money for their publishers to appeal to a mass audience, a mass readership in the big cities. And the editors quickly figure out that one way to grab a mass readership's attention and their pennies is to give them what looks to us like fake news. Like this. This was not a newspaper. It was a pamphlet based on a newspaper story. There was very little illustration at the time. But this is a story in the New York Sun about the inventor of a telescope so big he could see the surface of the moon and all of its weird inhabitants, like man-bats and beavers that walked upright. You can see some of them in the background. It's also the one about the flying machine that had just crossed the Atlantic in 3 days. Remember, this is 1844, a flying machine crossing the Atlantic in 3 days. The point, though, is not to fool readers. They're not trying to pull something over on people. No one expected readers to just believe these blindly. Readers already knew they had to approach newspapers with skepticism. The point was to open up the whole world of newspapers to new readers, ordinary working class and middle class readers who had always seen newspapers as something for the elites in the business world or in politics. These new newspapers were intended to be relevant to their lives, to the lives of the working class, the middle class, not just relevant, but even fun. They did this, the newspapers did this by inviting new readers to evaluate the news for themselves and to decide for themselves whether or not it was fake, rather than taking the word of the upper class. You could even call it the democratization of the newspaper. Here, you can decide for yourselves. You're just as smart as anybody who works on Wall Street. So this was the way that the mass newspapers got their start, and they moved off from that pretty quickly. But it was an effective tactic. So for this first 200 years, the American newspaper is filled with lots of stuff that's true and lots of stuff that wasn't, and it didn't bother anybody. Nobody expected or wanted it to be otherwise. Readers approached every issue with the understanding that they had to figure out which parts were intended to be true, which might turn out to be true next week, which would never be true at all. Things changed slowly as the 19th century went on. Papers remained messy and quirky. Again, it's important to note that some newspapers are doing honorable, public-spirited work, like the vigorous and committed anti-slavery press, or papers that found new ways to expose wrongdoing, like Nellie Bly, who went undercover, did undercover reporting in a hospital for women with mental illness and exposed the brutal conditions there. So there is a lot of stuff in newspapers that is serving the function of informing the public about important issues of common interest. But much of the newspaper press in the late 19th century was also pretty bad. And in fact, some journalists were talking openly about how much fun it was to fake. And they used that word. This is a journal, a trade journal for writers, mainly journalists. And they insisted that faking was not exactly lying, which is not really as nefarious as we might think. It doesn't mean insisting that Joe Biden stole the 2020 election. Mainly, it means adding juicy details, filling in stuff you'd missed, making a story more appealing, sometimes even making up a whole story that people would understand wasn't serious, like this one. On the front page of a newspaper that's also reporting on the weather and on a murder, the 4 o'clock lizard bites. Then you die on the hour. And supposedly this was the story told by an old salt in one of the Caribbean islands who said there's a special kind of lizard, and if it bites you, the next time the clock strikes 4, whether it's morning or afternoon, you will die. I don't think people believed that, but what purpose did it serve? It was entertaining. And I think people were entertained by understanding that it was not true. Lots of journalists thought this was just fine. It was a service to their readers to make the news more entertaining. Not to mention it would sell a lot of newspapers. But some journalists are starting to disagree. Some citizens are starting to disagree. The battle over whether faking is acceptable marks a critical turning point in U.S. journalism. There's a growing sense in some news organizations and in some citizens that journalism is too sensational, that is not trustworthy, that it fakes too much, that is not serving citizens well in difficult times, that it wasn't doing the work of democracy. So starting around the 1890s, these responsible news organizations decide to do something about that. And what they do is they invent journalism, what I'm calling real journalism. They start to establish clear standards and conventions and ethical guidelines for how to do good work, to publicize them so people would know what to expect. And here's when objectivity takes hold as a value. You could almost say objectivity was invented to stamp out fake news. But objectivity does not mean, the common misperception holds, does not mean that journalists should never betray opinion. They should just blindly report this side and call them equal. What it meant at the time, described most famously by the progressive journalist and reformer Walter Lippmann in the 1920s, was that journalists should work like scientists. They should base their reporting on evidence and on critical thinking, on reason. And since we've just wandered through the 19th century, we can see what a departure critical thinking and reason were from a traditional approach. Reporting objectively meant journalists should investigate systematically. They should rigorously test their own assumptions. They should work to scrupulously and unemotionally verify the facts like scientists would. So that if journalists did their job right, and that's always been a big if, but if they did their job right, readers would be confident that the reporter had provided all the information they needed, not just the information that might match the reporter's own convictions or that the politicians wanted their constituents to believe, but that reporters would be giving readers evidence-based information produced without bias. And not only did journalists established professional conventions and standards that marked good professional journalism, they also publicly criticized unworthy journalism that did not uphold those standards. They admitted their own mistakes when they made them, which is kind of risky, right? There's always the possibility that if journalists ratted out their colleagues for getting things wrong or got things wrong themselves and admitted it, that readers would just dismiss them as sloppy or stupid or untrustworthy or malicious. But journalists begin to believe that being honest and transparent when they get things wrong and publicly correcting the record would restore their credibility with their readers. In other words, parts of the journalistic profession, and again, it's not all of them, there are still some who are off reporting about 4 o'clock lizards, but parts of the journalistic profession start to police themselves and their fellow journalists, to hold themselves accountable for doing good ethical journalism that lived up to standards. There's a famous example in the Boston Globe in 1892. You probably know a little bit about this, about a sensational local murder. A quiet middle-aged woman who was accused of hacking her father and stepmother to death with an axe. Might have been 40 whacks, it might have been 41 in Fall River, Massachusetts. And journalists from all over the country were competing ferociously to cover the Lizzie Borden trial. The Globe got hold of some lurid secondhand information about a shocking secret motive. Lizzie Borden, says the informant, killed her father because he had discovered her terrible secret that she was pregnant out of wedlock with her uncle's child. And the paper is so eager for this sensational scoop, it publishes the news without checking it, and it all turned out to be completely, wildly wrong. So the paper confessed. The paper publicly acknowledged on the next day's front page it got things wrong. The Detective McHenry was the source of the information, and he was wrong. It has been proven wrong. Henry Trickey, his statement, Trickey is the reporter, and that's his statement. It even also, after describing what it did wrong, on the inside pages, the Boston Globe reprinted some of the criticisms from other local newspapers, criticisms that called it a fake, a tissue of lies. It is false. And in this case, it's clearly calling it a fake is not calling it something chummy and reader friendly. The Globe is saying, we're really sorry. We're sorry we faked. You can trust us not to do it again. So journalists don't always take the high road, of course, but this is an important turning point in the way that respectable, responsible news organizations began to treat their errors. And it made clear that journalistic faking, even if readers liked it, was unacceptable. And you could tell professional journalists by their refusal to countenance faking. It's doing real journalism and claiming the right to denounce fake journalism. But, and you knew there was a but coming, right? Even then, even at the very beginning of real journalism, some newspapers are already figuring out how to manipulate the accusations of fake as a way to criticize facts, true facts, evidence-based facts they disagree with. Throughout the Jim Crow era, much of the white press in the South essentially operated as a propaganda machine. It was aggressively supporting white supremacy with news that should have been labeled fake. They filled their columns with lurid fabrications about unspeakable crimes committed against white women by predatory Black men, often including calls to lynch the attacker. And in a tactic that looked mighty familiar, they worked to undermine and tarnish their opponents by branding as fake the truthful news they didn't like. And here you see that word. Ida Wells. Ida Wells was a famous African-American activist and journalist who was infuriating many white Southerners with her investigative reporting, showing that sex crimes by Black men against white women were in fact very rare. Her reporting was accurate. But the mainstream Atlanta Constitution, which is one of the South's most important papers and also one most dedicated to upholding white supremacy, chose to use the word fake to dismiss her work, and that word had power. Another challenging arena for real journalism has always involved how to respond to new communications technologies, and there have been many. We're seeing them again in the world of digital and social media, but the questions are always the same. How is this new thing going to be used in journalism? How should it be used in journalism? What are the rules for journalism And are they different from the rules for other uses of those technologies? How will people know how to evaluate what's true and what's fake? Who, if anyone, has the right or the obligation to protect the public from fake information? These questions are still urgent today. For instance, in the 19th century, photography is invented in 1839, but it isn't really used in journalism till after 1900. The technology to mass produce photographs or to reproduce them in the daily newspaper press was non-existent for a long time, and then it was lousy. So you could see photographs in galleries in the 19th century. You could buy them yourself, but you didn't see them in the daily press as part of journalism at all in the 19th century, which is just as well, because some photographers very quickly discovered how to manipulate people's faith in the special and intimate relationship that photography seemed to have with reality. In 1840, Edgar Allan Poe had seemed to summon up the common attitude when he raved that the photograph is infinitely more accurate in its representation than any painting by human hands. The closest scrutiny of the photogenic drawing discloses only a more absolute truth, said Poe. Photography gives you a more absolute truth, a more perfect identity of aspect with the thing represented. And then along comes a photographer called William Mumler, and he produces this bit of more absolute truth. What do you think you see? It's a ghost. You think you see a ghost. Mumler had a tactic. He sat his sitters down and took a photograph and went into the darkroom, came out and said, "Look at this. This is the most amazing thing. I have no idea how this happens. There's something about the spirit life and they reflect their own light." Obviously, it was a fraud. He was probably using some kind of double exposure, but people ate them up, even at a price that in current terms was anywhere between, it was probably around $50 a piece, because this new technology was mysterious and powerful, and who knew what it could do? Why couldn't it reveal truths beyond the power of the naked eye? Experts scoffed, officials sued, he was put on trial for fraud. They couldn't prove how he did it, so he was let off on a technicality, but many people refused to believe he was a fake. They missed Mom. They preferred to get their own gut feeling to what experts told them, which is another familiar pattern. They don't want to be told by experts what to believe themselves. Another new technology comes along in the 1890s. Just as newspapers were setting rules for what was fake and what was real, this one also had a very complicated relationship with truth. Moving pictures, which seemed to show real life in a whole new way, more intimate, more authentic. Most of them were pure entertainment, even fantasy. Filmmakers played with what was possible. Here's this is going to take me a second to set up, but here's one example of the kind of playfulness in early film. I'm going to go through this quickly. It went only a minute, but I'll go through it quickly enough that you can see what it's all about. Yeah, and I blew it. So you get a sense of what's going on there. But in 1898 and 1899, there are moving pictures that seem to offer something never before possible. They seem to bring the viewers straight into the war zones in Cuba and the Philippines, with troops rebelling against the Spanish occupiers. You can see these films on the Library of Congress website if you're interested in them. It seemed to show journalistically, this is what it's like to be at war. They seemed to be real journalism. But what most viewers didn't know was that motion picture cameras of the day were huge and clumsy and couldn't keep up with the action, the swift and unpredictable action on the battlefield. It's impossible to run around on a field of battle dragging a thing that's this big. It's dangerous too. They also didn't know that viewers didn't know that because of these technical challenges, those exciting shots they saw of rebel Cuban or Filipino troops waving the US flag, charging out of the ditch, flinging up their arms and falling over dead, were actually staged near Edison Studio in West Orange, New Jersey, just across the river from New York City. And they featured the New Jersey National Guard all dressed up in rakish costumes. So unlike newspapers with boundaries between journalistic use and entertainment, moving pictures, the boundaries were extremely blurry. There were no professionals yet with the stature to set the rules for what counted as real or to insist that colleagues follow the rules. So for years, with moving pictures, people didn't know what they were seeing. And as with photography, they were often being manipulated or fooled by people who understood the technology better than they did. Around the same time, another weird new technology with uncertain rules comes along. This is radio, inhabiting this weird mystical realm called the airwaves or the ether. And in its earliest days before World War I, the military and ships at sea were using radio as a two-way communications device. Nobody was regulating its use, which attracted a whole breed of amateurs and tinkerers known as hams. Many, if not most of them, were young men. They built their own radio sets out in the garage or up in the attic. They used them to create all sorts of chaos and mischief. They would interfere with military transmissions. They would send out fake naval orders. They would send out fake distress signals. Anonymous young men darting into an invisible space, pulling elaborate pranks against powerful institutions. That does sound familiar, doesn't it? But the crisis that came in April of 1912, when somebody broadcast a message telling the waiting world that the great ocean liner Titanic had sunk, but that everyone was safe and coming home. Of course, this is not true. 1,500 people died. And it's not clear who started the story or whether it was an error or malice, but the whole thing led the US Congress to regulate the airwaves for the first time. Until then, communications of almost any kind have been sheltered from any kind of government involvement. But the Radio Act of 1912 included large fines for anyone who sent any false or fraudulent signal, call, or other radiogram of any kind. So that was another response to the challenge of evaluating the truthfulness of a new technology. In its very first attempts to regulate the messy world of the airwaves, the US government made the controversial claim it had the right to specifically outlaw fake information. That attempt became moot pretty quickly when in 1917, the Navy took control of the airwaves as a wartime measure. It ordered all amateur activity shut down, but the controversy continues to this day as we all debate whether Facebook and other powerful platforms should be regulated. So by the beginning of the 20th century, there's an understanding in the US that the job of real journalism is to tell the truth. That to do that, real journalism has certain standards and ethics, and that journalists have the responsibility of following the rule themselves and enforcing the rules on their colleagues. For instance, journalism is not funny stories about people on the moon. Journalists are supposed to verify whether something is both important and true. If journalists make mistakes, they should correct them. It's true that rules are still evolving for some other technologies like the motion pictures. And there's still some debate about whether the government has the right or the obligation to tell people when information is fake. But journalists are increasingly arguing that real journalism is a profession with clear standards and rules that's dedicated to discovering, verifying, and presenting the facts impartially and accurately, and that it will denounce fakers who don't live up to the standards of the profession, and it will hold them accountable. So here's what I meant when I said at the beginning that real journalism offered important weapons against the spread of faking journalism. Real journalism itself was that weapon. Journalists would hold other journalists accountable. But as I also suggested, the paradox of real journalism is that it also encourages the growth and spread of fake journalism. And there are several reasons for that. First, since responsible journalists have rooted their identity, have staked their identity in the practice of neutrality and accuracy, people who disagree with what they're saying can just accuse them of bias and inaccuracy rather than engaging with the content of what they said, as we saw with the Atlanta Constitution about Ida B. Wells. And second, ideologues and partisans who have no connection to journalism are able to produce fake journalism simply by disguising themselves as real journalists and appropriating their credibility, creating some kind of authentic or authentic seeming perch or platform from which to present false information or heavily politicized opinion or propaganda in a form specifically crafted to look or sound like real journalism, and that claims to follow the rules of impartial investigation and rigorous verification. And it spreads its own brand of disinformation by exploiting the credibility that serious journalism has been working hard to earn. And that has been increasingly common through the 20th and the 21st centuries. We see it especially in times of war and crisis, when there's a lethal combination of publics that feel vulnerable and governments that feel anything is permissible for victory. World War I, for instance, was known for the appalling creativity of its propaganda, that painting the German enemy as monstrous and evil. We've all heard the fake stories about the Huns spitting babies on bayonets, raping nuns, cutting off children's hands. But one story had a disturbingly long life. It was a classic piece of fake journalism. In 1917, newspapers from London to Hong Kong to Rio to Washington were reporting that the Germans were gathering the corpses of their own dead soldiers and melting them down to make grease for munitions and feed for the pigs. And one of the news organizations responsible for spreading the story was the Reuters news agency, a formerly and now currently again respectable news organization, but at the time it was secretly controlled and financed by the British government, which used the cover of what seemed to be a real journalistic organ to plant all sorts of propaganda that looked exactly like real news in the London Times. And after the war, when the story was exposed as a fraud, many citizens who realized they'd been duped were mortified, but they also vowed they would never believe stories of wartime atrocity again. Think about that for a minute, because that would have disastrous consequences in the next war, World War II, when new atrocity reports came in from Germany about death camps and mass killings in gas chambers. And some very high-level influential officials remembered the fake atrocity stories that came from Germany about death, about the corpse factories, and they took exactly the wrong lesson. We're not going to fall for that kind of nonsense again. Chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee of the British Cabinet is not believing what he's hearing about German death camps because, well, it's just more fake atrocity stories. Other kinds of fake journalism were created by one of the most secretive, powerful, and unaccountable organizations in the world, the CIA. During the Cold War, it operated under the premise that the worldwide communist threat was so alarming, posed so great a moral danger, that any and all weapons to counter its strength were justifiable. So among its other tactics, it created fake news organizations staffed by fake journalists, placed its own fake journalists in real news organizations, used real journalists overseas as real undercover agents. The rationale made sense to the agency because journalists could openly travel anywhere and ask questions of anybody who would be better positioned to carry out a little espionage along the way, a little intelligence work. And because journalists operated on the currency of trust, why not take advantage of that trust and divert it to the service of a greater cause? Eventually, real journalists helped expose the CIA's dirty tricks, and some appeared before Congress to argue in eloquent terms that the agency must not compromise the integrity of American institutions. But the high-level intelligence officer Ray Klein was unrepentant. He argued that there was no difference between journalists and spies. He said they both paid sources and stole documents, so what does it matter? So that's one kind of fake journalism, the appropriation of what looks like journalism and the exploitation of journalistic values by outside actors for propaganda or political purposes, which usually end up undermining the credibility of real journalism. I'm not going to argue that real journalism hasn't done some undermining of their own in recent years. Journalists can make honest mistakes and unintentional errors, and I wouldn't call that fake journalism, but obviously purposeful fabricators like Jason Blair, Stephen Glass, Janet Cook did grave damage to real journalists. And there are plenty of examples of mainstream news organizations that go through the motions of professional investigation and verification, but nonetheless end up persuading themselves that the story they wished were true was actually true. Like when CBS's 60 Minutes questioned George W. Bush's conduct in the Texas Air National Guard during the Vietnam era when he was running for president. The questions came up. They based it on dubious documents they didn't want to scrutinize too closely that turned out to be fake. Or when respectable news organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post supported the White House's insistence that Saddam Hussein was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction without doing their own more independent investigations. And of course, the weapons of mass destruction turned out not to exist. But there's also lots and lots more fakery of all kinds in the media. A turning point was Bill Clinton's presidency, which represented a perfect storm. A controversial president who inspired among many Americans what pundits were calling Clinton derangement syndrome, a raft of personal and financial scandals, many of which were true, an atmosphere of hyper-partisanship in Washington, the involvement of a billionaire, Richard Mellon Scaife, who poured money into an endeavor by a right-wing magazine to dig up dirt on the Clintons, the rise of the internet, the birth of Fox News, which took an audacious new approach to television journalism, gaining huge and loyal audiences by covering the news with an obvious conservative slant while insisting it was fair and balanced. It doesn't use that slogan anymore, but it still does insist that it's following the professional standards of accuracy and objectivity. And that it's journalists from the mainstream organizations, they say, who are biased. And all of these elements grew only stronger under Trump in the Trump era, with fake journalism solidifying its status as an essential driver of the political polarization and hyper-partisanship of public life. You just look at the websites or public statements of fake journalistic organizations like Breitbart, Daily Caller, Gateway Pundit, Project Veritas, Sinclair Broadcasting. They use the language of real journalism, claiming they're proud independent journalists. Look at their websites. They use words like that. They're devoted to the free and open exchange of ideas essential to maintaining a robust democracy. That it's the other mainstream organizations that are pushing their agendas and telling only one side of the story. Even as these organizations also run stories claiming things like Anthony Fauci created the COVID virus, or Democrats were buying votes in 2020, or climate change is a hoax. Also, you could take a look at the hundreds of local newspapers out there that have innocuous names like the Des Moines Sun or the Ann Arbor Times. They routinely describe themselves as providing objective, data-driven information without political bias. But readers are not told that those papers are controlled by shadowy networks of dark money funders, or that lots of their articles are secretly ordered up and paid for by corporate PR firms, right-wing political operatives, lobbyists, and conservative advocacy groups. There's been reporting on this in this Columbia Journalism Review, as well as I think the New York Times. Or look at Alex Jones, who owns InfoWars, and he's recently been ordered to pay tens of millions in damages to families of children killed in the Sandy Hook school shooting in 2012 that he insisted for years was a hoax. And all the while, as this archived page shows, he was calling himself a tenacious journalist who dominates news coverage and claims to wear our bias, the truth, openly and proudly on our sleeve. Now, at this point, I'm often asked, okay, so what can we do about fake news? And if that's why you come, I appreciate, but I have to disappoint you. Smarter people than I am have been working on this question with increasing urgency and only modest success. It's certainly true that the word unprecedented fits a lot of circumstances these days, from the toxic mendacity of political life to the immense and sometimes malign power of social media. There's also an almost wholesale collapse of public trust in mainstream journalism, some of which is obviously a response to its own mistakes and missteps. But it was only intensified by a president who openly declared journalists to be public enemies and worked to undermine and discredit them. People have suggested all sorts of potential remedies and solutions, from social media regulation to media literacy to boycotts to institutionalized fact-checking to credentials for journalists. And then there's the idea floated more and more often by mainstream media and many of their consumers that it might be time to ditch objectivity, that traditional foundation of professional journalism. They argue that journalists should be more open about their subjectivity. They should go ahead and make value judgments. They should acknowledge that truths can be relative. And yes, there is certainly a lot to criticize about the practice of objectivity when it's badly done, which is often. It can lead to hypocrisy, to false equivalences. And there are times that it seems to define neutrality as the values of white and male-dominated institutions, which is a valid and serious concern. But as a historian of 3 centuries of fake news and fake journalism, I want to tell you why the idea of ditching objectivity for good rather than working to repair it concerns me. Ditching it would leave us with 2 main models for journalism. On the one hand, the empire of hyper-partisan fake journalism. Most of it is on the right, but not all of it. There is also some on the left. And this empire spreads its conspiracy theories, its disinformation, its malice, its mischief, disguised as professionally verified, objective, fair, and balanced reporting, unlike those other guys. On the other hand, there are the other guys, the mainstream media, who want to argue that it's time to be transparent about their own subjectivity, who acknowledge that truth can be partial and contingent, who assert their right to take a stand. And if mainstream journalists abandon objectivity completely, they would also be loosening their grip on its original commitment to examine and evaluate all evidence with intellectual honesty, critical thinking, to follow that evidence wherever it leads, even if they personally disagree with it. So I can see a media world where it's the fake journalists who are saying, you're just expressing your opinion, but we're reporting the unbiased facts, while the mainstream journalists can only respond, it's our opinion that your facts are wrong. I can see a world where it's the fake journalists who are denying their subjectivity while the mainstream journalists are flaunting theirs. I can see a world where it's the fake journalists who are claiming they're the only source for professionally verified facts, and the mainstream journalists are essentially saying this is important if true. A world where it's the fake journalists who are defining what real journalism is. And I can tell you in all the centuries that American journalism has been around, that's never gone well. Thank you for listening.
We're turning on our handheld wireless.
Okay. Well, let me get rid of the share.
I don't know.
All right. What I'm going to do is see hands raised, and I'll come over. Are you able to hear me all right, Professor?
I
Okay.
can, thank you.
All right, and I'll come over with the microphone. Here you go.
Thank you again for your talk, Professor. So a question about what you brought up earlier, I see kind of a trend when you look at it from a historical perspective to modern perspective, and that is that all these fake stories that were done over a century ago were done with more of an entertainment slant. But yet, looking at modern times, can that be also applied? A lot of these people who are pushing out their fake news as real is trying to just change what they are now turning is entertainment into education, where effectively they want to have this type of more of an entertainment focus while under the guise that it is actually journalism.
Yeah, there's a lot of journalism is so vast and sprawling and squishy. It's almost hard to know what qualifies as journalism and what doesn't. And there is certainly a lot of journalism that, you know, for good and valid reasons is also entertaining. But it seems to me that the dividing line is intentionality about accuracy. And the readers, the consumers, as well as the journalists both need to be on the same page. If a journalist is presenting something as entertainment and readers, consumers believe that it's true when it's not, that's where I see a challenge. And I think there's more of that now, because people are the default assumption is that journalists are supposed to be telling the truth. The 19th century, you didn't see that so much because the whole thing, the whole ecosystem of journalism was so different.
I see. Sorry, just making a follow up on that. That's just basically a product of the time.
I'm sorry.
It's basically a product of the time. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much for your talk. There is an issue that I think needs to be addressed that's not really part of your talk, which is the tendency in some sources to disregard, to suppress information, not put out fake information, but suppress truthful information. So because it doesn't fit the particular narrative. For example, you think of Walter Durant, he's reporting on the terror famine, or his non-reporting of the terror famine in Ukraine and then after the Bolsheviks took power. That's a very powerful thing, and I think you can see that a lot. But I don't know how you would. Do you have any thoughts about how do you address, the public doesn't know about this information because it's been deliberately hidden.
Yeah.
Hidden rather than suppressed.
Some of it is definitely suppressed.
Yeah.
There's not a question of, there's an intentionality.
Those are really hard questions. Journalism is hard to do. I teach at a journalism school, and there are no easy decisions. There are no, people debate and argue all the time. Journalists get it wrong sometimes. You're right. It's really hard to know what's not being reported. No matter what the motive. If it is suppression, that is not a good thing, but it could also simply be busyness or disinclination or not having a reporter on the staff who knows something about it. All of those things go into making journalism that is incomplete. But for a news consumer to know what's missing, for a news consumer to know what's not being reported is a real challenge. And as you say, it's very difficult to know how to handle that, except for readers to take critical thinking to all of their consumption of news.
To follow up on Walter's comment and a question there, it seems to me, we're all very busy, careers, family and so forth. And, ideally we would say watch Fox and MSNBC. It's very unlikely that both of them would omit something, although perhaps, they're both corporate. So it's possible that there would be particular perspectives or even information that wouldn't be shared with their customers, their viewers. But if you watch both of them, you're probably not going to suffer from omission, at least in political context. I wonder what your thought about that would be.
Now, that's a really good point, and that's something that we try to make sure our young journalists understand as well, that it's very easy in the modern digital world and in the very busy world. It's very easy to choose a narrow stream of information. Get all your information from the same kind of news organization. A really good way to understand more about what's going on in the world is to read information coming from organizations that you think might not be the kind that you would instantly agree with their interpretations. So yeah, it's really important and really hard and really challenging to view on both sides. It's also, you want to be careful to compare some mainstream organizations to some of those fake journalism organizations I was talking about gives you a kind of a false equivalence. Also, it's a difficult tension. But yeah, read and view as much as you can.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Sort of two comments. One, I was surprised you didn't mention the classic story of Ben Franklin's scalps of colonists that were delivered to King George, which was part of his attempt to get people to unite and shake off England. So there's biases, and then there's the motivations for them.
That's in the book. That wasn't in my talk, but it's in my book. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I've read the Franklin biography, and that's really interesting. And my other comment is, there's this move in science nowadays. NASA is kind of pushing this idea of open science, where people have access to a lot of the data. Now, in the case of journalism, there's issues of confidential sources and being able to protect people from possibly being threatened if they revealed something, that other people don't want to say. But I'm wondering whether some variant of that might be possible with news organizations.
Some variant of open
Being able,
sourcing.
or open source, open science type stuff of
Mhm.
making a lot more of the data available
Mhm.
for stuff. I mean, that's one of the challenges that
Yeah, there's sort of interjournalistic attempts at doing that. I'm thinking of the consortium that got hold of the Panama Papers, a huge trove of papers that belonged to an offshore legal company that ended up exposing heads of state around the world, important people, elected leaders,
yeah.
political leaders, and it ended up exposing a lot of financial corruption. This was a database that was so huge that no single news organization could deal with it. So it was a consortium that got together, and everybody in the consortium worked on different parts of it, and were able to come out with a wide variety of other sources. So it's not exactly opening the database to the general public, but it was opening the database to an enormous range of journalists with an enormous range of backgrounds and interests. And that was really interesting. There are some efforts to crowdsource. They tend to be kind of ad hoc. They tend to be, but if you look at the New York Times, they often have a little thing in the corner. We're writing a story about people who were caught up in Hurricane Ian, and we want to know what you think. So they're inviting people to be sources. So there are various ways to think more openly about how you get your data and how you get your information, but it also goes up against long traditions of news organizations thinking, and this is our stuff, we want to guard it.
One aspect about crowdsourcing that I really like with, say, Twitter, blue checked contributors who turn out to be like world-class experts and so forth that weigh in. And sometimes you have, some discussion amongst experts with different beliefs, but that to me is a wonderful thing rather than having to wait for letters to the editor, which could be edited or even omitted. And, there are such good things, I think, about Twitter and other social media where voices can be heard. And of course, there's cacophony as well, but to be able to see that, and hopefully the journalists are watching that channel as well.
Yeah.
Going back to the issue of science and NASA, one of the things that's been coming up in the last couple of years is the large number of scientific results that basically have been faked or misinterpreted. So if the gold standard of objectivity, the scientific method, could be manipulated, how much that feeds into the people that aren't scientifically literate says, well, if science can get it wrong, what does objectivity even mean in a non-scientific context? So how's that feeding this sort of non-objectivity in the world?
That's a good and tough question. There's been a decline in trust in almost any institution in American life since about the 70s. Gallup has been tracking it, and journalists have fallen in public trust. So have scientists, so have politicians, so has medicine. Some of it is a response to people knowing more and holding these institutions more accountable. Some of it is the cacophony and hyperpartisanship of public life. Science has had its embarrassments. So has journalism. So have so many other institutions as well. Is it better that we know about their failures and therefore judge them more harshly? I think I'd rather know about their failures, but it does make it really hard to make a credible statement that people will trust.
Yeah, Marv's comment, the replication crisis, as far as being able to replicate earlier scientific studies. Following up on your comment about how journalism tracked by Gallup, I looked this up. So it was about 70% of the public having some or a lot of trust in journalists back in the mid 70s. But one thing that frustrated me was it looks like they didn't track it again until 1997.
Really?
Yeah, so if you see the graph, if people want to Google this, it's Gallup Media Use and Evaluation. So you can see the graph, and there isn't a data point between 76 and 1997, where it has dropped to 50%. And then my question would have been to you, hey, what do you think caused this? And of course, there's invisible ups and downs over those 2 decades where Gallup was not tracking. Oh, by the way, an earlier question that I'm following up on, where I'd love to have Gallup or some other respected pollster ask folks, do you watch, say, Fox and MSNBC? I'd love to see how many people watch both, because I think that might be sort of the, hey, how consumers, at least in a political conversation, of course, both of them probably report straight on like the NASA impact on the asteroid and so forth. That's not really a political subject.
There's been some work done by the Pew Research Center in looking into trust and also looking into what people, how people consume partisan news. And there, as I recall, it's much more common for people who call themselves on the left to read news from the right than it is for people who call themselves on the right to read news from the left. But there is crossover. There is some modest crossover among people who read from both sides.
So yes, you talked about how when involve politics, it's not really symmetrical right now in how each side treats their ways of controlling their biases. Do you see the same asymmetry in journalism that has a nonprofit versus a for-profit mentality? In other words, for-profit, if you're competing for hits, a more sensationalistic title will give you a competitive advantage over one that's not. And in that case, it reminds me of a discussion I had actually last time at this meeting. Is I forgot the actual subject on this, but it was a study on apples where they said, if I were a journalist, which of these 2 titles on your article will attract more people to read it? One where it says Apple, they're just safe as good as you think they were, or apples, they might kill your children. So I would like to elaborate on that, please.
Yeah. The nonprofit journalism sector in the United States is not anywhere near as robust as it is in much of the rest of the world. Many European countries have a very strong public broadcasting, particularly sector. In the U.S., there are, I think, noticeable differences. If you watch the PBS NewsHour, I get a sense that there is great care taken to be both rigorous and critical, but also to be well-rounded. And there are stories I see on PBS that I have not seen elsewhere. NPR is similar. I noticed it particularly. I don't know, and I don't want to say simply because NPR is a public station. That's not the answer. But in the beginning of Trump's term, there was a great debate over whether journalists should use the term lie. And many mainstream news organizations applied the word lie to what Trump was saying, and NPR refused. NPR said, we don't want to drive away people who, hearing that, would assume that we are giving them reporting that is biased. So that's a small example. I don't want to enlarge from it too much, but I think there is a different focus in nonprofit or public supported news sometimes.
You know, you mentioned about news organizations from other countries. This is a personal opinion. It seems to me BBC News actually has rather complete political coverage of the United States. Not to get into the particular details, but when one president says his predecessor called Nazis and white nationalists very fine people, and they said, no, keep that video going. And like a minute later, he says, I'm not talking about Nazis and white nationalists because they should be condemned totally. You know, it's like if you're a BBC News watcher, you're aware of that. Whereas maybe in the United States, it's hit or miss.
Yeah.
As far, and then of course, Jake Tapper of CNN does refute, you know, here's why that doesn't matter, but at least discuss it.
Hi there.
Hi.
We have a new industry in this country for the past few years, and that's fact checking.
Mm.
It's a brand new industry, it feels like. I have sort of a strange hobby. I bicker with Trump fans on a Fox News website,
Mhm.
and I frequently see this comment. And I've really pretty much ignored it, but recently I actually answered it on another site. And this comment comes up all the time. Who fact checks the fact checkers?
Yeah.
Okay, this is my first question. Then I have another one after that. Can you answer that question?
Well, there is no like Praetorian Guard around the fact checkers. Some of what goes on is some fact checking organizations are very serious, dedicated, nonpartisan, public spirited. Some of them masquerade as fact checking and are in fact partisan organizations. So one thing to do if you're judging the fact checkers is figure out who, where their roots are, who's funding them, where they get their support. I am somebody who has faith in the idea of fact checking, and if it's a reputable organization doing the work, I tend by default to say I'll trust that without requiring further confirmation. But I want to know where they come from.
Okay. Well, my quick and dirty answer to somebody recently actually was other fact checkers.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Who can be you? I mean, we can all do our own fact checking.
Right. Okay. And by the way, I want to put in a plug for a site that I use all the time. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's called Media Bias Fact Check.
I don't know that one.
If you've never looked at it, take a look at it.
I will.
It started from being very small and scrappy, and now it's really expanded and it looks very, very professional. And I think they do a great job.
I'll
And
take
once
a
again,
look.
it's called
Thank you.
Media Bias Fact Check. Okay, here's my second question. Okay.
Mhm.
To what extent does what you do take into account the education of people in this country? And I say that I'm constantly saying this. We have way too many undereducated adults in this country.
Mhm.
And I think there are two things that I notice all the time. Really a lack of reading comprehension skills and really extreme numerical illiteracy.
Mhm.
And for example, we see the latter in being unable to explain election fraud to people, and how small it is. And because we have so much numerical illiteracy, that's voter fraud is like an accepted fact. I'm just curious as to how much though that kind of background factors into what you do in studying journalism. Is your audience?
The audience is one of the hardest phenomena to investigate. You're right that it's very difficult to think about the audience in an abstract as a homogeneous mass, because so many people bring so many different backgrounds and experiences and educational levels. But to understand the audience has always been really hard. People, how do you figure out what they want, what they need? You ask them. How do you pose the question? How do you interpret the answer?
I think it's important to acknowledge my observation, which is that most are way too many adults in this country read at the 6th grade level and not higher. And I think I once read that newspapers are written for people who don't read above the 6th grade level. It's a really serious problem. And I think that it should be part of taking into consideration by the journalism profession.
No,
That's
you're right. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. That's
Do you think there might be utility for having actually sort of a fake news beat, in the sense that, to give you an example that how it works, is that it worked in one case, is, as you realize, that the president of the United States announced that the Russians were about to invade Ukraine. And by doing that, he kind of cut underneath any sort of fake news or disinformation that the Russians were going to put out about the invasion. And what you can see in many cases, if you watch the internet, of course you do, and you'll see basically certain ideas and stuff causing a swarming of people who they begin to get violent, or they begin to get dangerous. And if people would warn people more about those, maybe we would do a lot to reduce the dangers of these fake news and fake stories that go out. Do you think that an actual, sort of like fake news beat would be useful for many in the media?
It's an interesting idea, but it's also really challenging because it's hard to know how such a beat could be distributed. People use the news that they want. They go to the news that they want. In the 50s and 60s, something like more than 90% of the viewing public would watch one of the 3 network news broadcasts every night at 6:30. So people were seeing the same thing. People around the country from many different educational levels, backgrounds, experiences, we're all seeing the same thing. There is nothing like that now. There is no mass media that everybody pays attention to. So to think about, there are small scale, essentially fake news beats. I think there are many news organizations that work to expose or correct or rectify fake news, but how far it can travel, there's still going to be many, many more people who don't see the correction or the rectification than those who do.
The latest issue of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's been around for about 45 years, seeing things from a skeptical perspective, discusses inoculation against disinformation. To follow up on this gentleman's comment, if people want to Google this to get more information about the concept of, essentially preparing people for what they're probably going to hear from propagandists. By the way, I sort of exercised that on my way here. There's Radio Sputnik broadcasting at 105.5 FM from Russia, ownership, and they're discussing about the retreat of the Russian troops, just definitely from the Putin-esque perspective. But as you might imagine, with propagandists, they'll mix in genuine, or what I believe to be genuine science, health, other kind of non-war related topics to make their readers think, that part I know is true, so maybe this other stuff might be as well. They're tricky devils, but it's a good mental exercise, I think, to expose yourself to propaganda that you can be almost certain is propaganda, and then calibrate your brain. I did want to ask you before I hand off to this other gentleman, you're in an academic environment, the next generation of journalists and so on. Are they taught what we would skeptics call critical thinking skills?
Yeah, they are. That's a big part of it. There is a course we offer called Evidence and Inference that teaches students how to, not just how to report information, but how to evaluate it, how to determine where to find the right kind of information that will answer the questions that they're asking. That's a lot of the reporting work is very much rooted in evaluating their sources, questioning their sources, questioning themselves. We push them to question themselves.
I have to say, there's a recent example where I was hoping that what you said is true, and that is in the Washington Post. They posted an article about the retreating Russians and what was left behind in this house, and they found all these letters decrying their low morale and arguing with their superiors and writing sad letters that strangely were left behind. It's like, we don't have time, Conrad. You cannot take your paper with you. and they were all very similar in content. In the Washington Post article said, as if they had sat together and composed them, and then I, as a skeptic, would say, or that these were created as propaganda, and they didn't even suggest that possibility to the readers. And it's just like the idea of injecting massive doses of IQ into the news media. And I have an idea about that, and I'll follow up in a moment. I'm hogging the microphone. I can feel my heat on it from my hand. That's when I know I have
Well, don't worry. I'll see if I can outdo you then. So yes, ironically, I was gonna see if I can go back again to history and see if that can be used as a leverage of those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. An example is of the literally named Dark Ages time period. How did German journalism go down into that dark period, and what contributions did journalism do to bring our society out of the Dark Ages? Would you know anything about that?
What do you mean exactly by the Dark Ages?
The time period when science was basically pushed aside for basically non-science perspectives and such, where basically anything that was evidence-based and
when I mean there are a number of Dark Ages that I want to understand which ones you talk.
Well, now I gotta find out the exact years, and I unfortunately
Not
don't
exact
remember.
years, but are you talking about contemporary Dark Ages, or are you talking about
The historical one that
historical
actually is,
Dark Ages, like the Middle Ages?
well, I forgot the actual, but this terminology was applied to a time period which was indicated as the Dark Ages. I don't know if anyone else here would.
Okay, no, I Dark Ages, I've heard it used metaphorically about current.
Oh, I see. Well, then I'm out of touch then. I'm sorry. You want to say something?
I've said something bad about the Washington Post. Let me say something good. Our group makes awards called the Philip J. Klass Award, who happened to be an aerospace journalist, but we give it out to non-journalists. One of them is a journalist, Joel Achenbach at the Washington Post.
I know his work.
Yes, won that from us. So we have good people there. I did contact him at the onset of the pandemic. The White House every day for a month or more had two scientists in front of the world saying, hey, here's what's going on. Obviously, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. And frustratingly, the people posing questions to them were political, the White House correspondents. And I really wanted to have health scientists, or at least health scientists, saying to their counterparts, hey, ask this, rather than, hey, when are we getting the masks? And that was the one that was like, oh, there it is again. But the questions about, the science side of it that weren't being asked. And that to me was another frustration of, this wasn't a political context, it could be, but definitely wanted to have science people posing questions to these scientists who were telling the world what was happening, what to do to protect themselves, and so on. So that was a frustrating thing. And Joel, as far as I know, Joel Achenbach did not contact his White House correspondent counterpart and say, hey, include this in your questions, will you? I'm sorry, Marv, you wanted to ask.
Okay, I want to make more of a comment, but I'll make it a question by saying, what do you think of this?
Okay.
Last night I heard Chris Wallace being interviewed, and he said, I thought it was interesting, during the first 20 or 30 years of TV, news was basically a lost leader, that the stations thought it was their duty to present the news. And 60 Minutes, CBS's show, really changed all that. He said it was a good show, but it showed that a network can make money doing news. And that sort of changed the whole environment, where now news organizations had to get eyeballs to watch them, so they'd get more advertisers, and they'd then foster more facts that would attract the people they already had. And that changed the whole news business to where it now becomes a profit center of presenting people. It's basically, what do you think of that whole concept?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. 60 Minutes was a new thing. 60 Minutes, it was criticized too. Remember, it was criticized severely for people who thought it was trivializing the news, that it was looking only for drama, that it chose only stories that were dramatic. But it did make the news something that people chose to watch because they found it both interesting and entertaining. But another of the really important factors that changed the news business was in the 80s and 90s, the wave of mergers and acquisitions. They had been independent before. When CBS was run by CBS, CBS News could be a little corner of their company. And yes, it was almost like it was where you went to put on your public service toga. You did serious stuff, and that gave you the rest of CBS license to do, sitcoms and Bonanza, was that CBS anyway? But what happened when Cap Cities and then Disney, when Westinghouse, when the other corporate owners began to look to the news divisions as just another profit center, that also put pressure on them to change and become more concerned with making money.
One thing I liked about 60 Minutes that others imitated later was the point counterpoint segment with Shana Alexander and James J. Kilpatrick. And it was so brief and superficial, but others took that on. I guess a Gronsky and Company, Crossfire on CNN, Fox with Hannity and Combs. Of course, you can dispute whether they were all doing them very well, but people of different political perspectives, journalists sitting around, that was a great place to do what I was saying earlier of, oh, I have to switch over to Fox now after watching MSNBC. One place where you can watch all these people and they would say, no, that's not true, or you've left this out. And you get that full coverage. And of course, there may be things still omitted due to ignorance or perhaps some rascally advocacy. But those were good things. And I'm hard pressed to think since Hannity and Combs, maybe CNN. That's another question. Forgive me, but CNN's revamping itself. What do you think of that? Do you think that they're heading towards the one-stop shopping, global political, at least domestically, United States, perspectives all in one spot rather than, oh, I have to switch to another channel to get the full story?
CNN has changed its identity a number of times over the years. I was once told about the rule of three. If there are three entities in any situation, two of them are going to compete against each other, and the third one will therefore go off on its own in order to distinguish itself by doing what the other two aren't. So with MSNBC and Fox, when they both grew more and more distinctly partisan, when in the 90s, CNN tried to be the middle one. It did not want to be partisan on either side. It tried to go down the middle. It tried to be nonpartisan. It changed several times because partisanship became more popular, it became more profitable. I think what it's doing now is again reverting to the rule of three and trying to distinguish itself from the partisan rancorousness of both MSNBC and Fox by trying to be more down the middle. It's harder to get away with these days because partisanship is baked into the way people look at the news and the way people look at society. So I think they're struggling, but I think that may be what they're trying to do.
So yes, we have spent a good amount of time talking about basically reporters in effective real life, but I want to just shift a bit to reporters in fiction. And two of them that I find very interesting are the main superhero of the DC comics and the Marvel comics, which is Clark Kent. Superman is a reporter, and Peter Parker is a reporting photographer. Have you seen that this has any type of influence onto your students? Of people who are in roles of heroism and selflessness have to have the ability to be somehow part-time involved in reporting their heroism, and maybe also encourage students to go into such type of dangerous and even risky to their own livelihood type of reporting, because of you have fictional reporters doing things that we typically see could be another form of heroism.
We could. It's an interesting question. I don't know for certain. I've never heard from any of my students that they were inspired to come to journalism school because of Clark Kent or Peter Parker. That's an interesting question. Some of them have said they were inspired to come to journalism school. These were older people, not my most recent students, by Woodward and Bernstein. So there are certainly heroic seeming journalists who do inspire people to follow in those footsteps. Don't know of any others. But maybe I should ask around.
Can I bring up some ideas, possibly crazy? I'm an outsider and naive. The idea of, scientists who retire. Wouldn't that be great to have them as peer reviewers of news stories embedded in the professional news environment? They are so awesome at finding internal inconsistencies, logical fallacies. They bring some IQ, which I mentioned earlier. And normally their role is letter to the editor or this Twitter type of response, but to have them right there in the newsroom or whatever the current way of doing things is remotely. It seems to me that could be a wonderful resource to really juice up the news media offices with a culture of, hey, don't forget this. You know, that they're typically outside of a political realm, and they could bring a dose of balance or vision that could be wonderful. And of course, all my opinion, and feel free to laugh. You've been polite. There you go. But I know what you mean.
Yeah, no, that's there is a sort of I mean, that's a more institutional way of looking at it, but in an uninstitutional, informal way, a lot of journalists do that. A lot of journalists who have a beat will have their favorite sources whom they will call consistently and regularly to ask them. I mean, journalists are never shy about asking for opinion, for fact checking, for advice, and that goes on. Especially the more specialized reporters who have who have formed a beat and know the people who are most important in it.
Okay. Here's another crazy idea. I don't know if you discussed ombudsman in your book.
No, I didn't. Not really.
Or my word here, which may be laughable, ambassador. So let's say Fox News has an ambassador to the Washington Post and vice versa.
Oh, interesting.
And then they're there, and you say they do a tour of duty for a couple months or something. Maybe embedded people out in the field, and they would have challenges. And I'm a sports fan. I watch the National Football League, and the head coach has one challenge flag per half. And if it's successful, if the replay shows, it's a red flag and they throw it on the field, if the officials look at it and say, you know what, you're right, that was a catch or whatever, you get not only the outcome of that play, but you get another red flag, right? So maybe you could have a system similar to that where it's like, hey, that ambassador challenged us and it turned out to be correct, and they get another challenge flag. Again, I'm making light of this. Sometimes when you make something intentionally amusing, it's sticky mimetically, and I am being a sneaky devil by trying to make it kind of goofy so that people cannot forget. I have another one. This morning, I heard someone mispronounce the word biosphere, but they said biosphere.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, I love that. We live in bubbles. And in fact, we want to call it a biosphere to make it a very, so I want to inject that into the world of biosphere.
I like that.
Please share that with your friends. And if, especially if you think it's silly, don't mention my name, Scott Snell, having thought of that. Let's see, again, I'm offloading my crazy questions as we may be wrapping up soon. Gosh, clickbait, even at top-notch websites. I'm not going to name names, but it's a local well-known newspaper where the headline doesn't match the content of the article. So it draws you in, and then you read every single word and interpret it carefully, well above 6th grade level. And it's like, no, that headline just doesn't fit. Please talk to your students, show them Goofus and Gallant. You remember from Highlights?
Oh, yes,
magazine?
I remember them.
How not to do journalism is Goofus. Gallant is on the other side, and he's doing these mismatching headline and article. Let's see. Am I running out of my crazy ideas? Never. I never run out of crazy ideas, but it's possible that I'm out. Oh, yes. You didn't mention the Hutchins Commission in your book. It was the Henry Luce Time Life, like 1942, where it's like, hey, what should we do as a profession? I'm just curious. It's possible that you or like, this is a minor aspect of 20th century, but I wonder if you might think about that and maybe work that into some future kind of like, oh, here's an addendum to your book in terms of American history of journalism, of the Hutchins Commission. Let's see, and goodness gracious, it's possible that I've run out of questions for the journalist professor. And I can't tell you enough how grateful I am for you to take such a long number of questions, and that your presentation is very complimentary to the Harvard Bookstore YouTube. So if they watch this and they watch the Harvard Bookstore interview with you earlier this year when your book first came out. By the way, I read the book. I highly recommend it.
I'm delighted.
And that people will get, it's like, oh, I'm learning more about this because you talked about different things in both with some overlap. But I'm very grateful because we all want to inform the public, and the ideal is that we're all very informed and helping each other out. My final dream is the future of this is something that we may not realize, which is we'll have artificial intelligence on our hips. I've got my cell phone, my smartphone here, but in the future, it will discuss news stories with you. And it's almost like having a super smart friend. All of us need super smart friends. And it's just like, hey, did you notice that this seems to be internally inconsistent? It's almost as if maybe they left something out. That's the usual giveaway of an omitted item from a news story, is an internal inconsistency where it's like, that doesn't quite compute. Maybe they left something important out. And it makes you at least try to find a primary news source. So much of this is just rascals. I'm almost certain I'm not a mind reader, but oh, that was another thought. I swear I'm wrapping up. Maybe we can train our political activists to be more truth lovers. So our political science activists, how do you become invincible as an advocate? You get all your facts straight and you steel man your opponents. So you don't straw man your opponents, you steel man them so that you give their absolute best arguments. In fact, you perhaps give awesome arguments they haven't thought of yet. That could happen. Then you say, here's what we have on our side. And if you are completely factual, you don't leave anything out, you're going to win. You're going to win a lot of the time. You may need help from the persuasive world of like, here's how to make it sticky mimetically. But it's a wonderful thing where I strongly suspect so much of us just don't agree on the facts. And if we agreed on the facts, we would get clarity, like me putting these glasses on. Well, obviously, we still need to discuss our matters of culture, matters of profound belief, faith-based things, which our group doesn't get into. We're into evidence-based claims rather than faith-based claims. And of course, we'll always have disagreements about things we can't be certain of. But eventually, I think we will eventually coalesce on fact sets. And I think our AI buddies will help with that. And God bless the activists. Some of them are working their butts off for good things, but let's get them to be honest. Get in those poli-science classes and say, remember, objective truth is your friend. And then it's like, I'm invincible now. I've got the facts on my side. All right. I think I'm going to, oh, wait. All right. I think we'll wrap up now.
Well, all right. Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed this so much. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.